What is up, y'all? This is the History Zone podcast with Zane Rosler. Today, I got a tale older than the U.S. itself. This one mixes insurrection with Catholicism, suspicion around Spanish priests, and drums. These, among other elements, led to the formation of one of the strongest uprisings in colonial America, the Stono Rebellion. Time to dig in. I want to start by talking about how South Carolina got its slaves. There were slaves in modern-day South Carolina documented as early as 1526 in a Spanish colony. However, that failed almost immediately. The plantation system that would develop in South Carolina began in 1670 when William Sale, the first governor, arrived in 1670 with 3 people he enslaved. Soon after, more people started arriving and importing slaves into the colony. It became such a big business that Charlestown, modern-day Charleston, became one of the biggest destinations of the slave trade in the North American colonies. By the 1730s, South Carolina had a well-established trading system with African civilizations. The most noteworthy was the Kingdom of Congo. One thing that made Congo notable was that it was a Catholic kingdom introduced by the Portuguese in 1491. Although most of the committed parishioners were the elites, Catholicism did hold an influence on the common people. Like most societies in West Africa, Congo went to war with smaller societies and enslaved the prisoners of war. When Europeans came, the demand for more people to enslave grew dramatically. They gave Congo items such as guns, horses, steel, and in return, Congolese people would arrive to the interior and bring people back to sell to the Europeans. This ensured a steady supply of forced labor to the Americas. Once slaves and wealthy owners arrived, they began a plantation economy of mostly rice, which grew very well in the cultivated swamplands of the South Carolina Lowcountry. It is also worth mentioning that the climate around Charleston is known to be hot and humid, even during some of the autumn months. The enslaved people were coerced to toil in the marshes under the heat in dirty water that is known to contain gators, venomous snakes, and mosquitoes. Meanwhile, the wealthy landowners were reaping the rewards that their slaves would never see. Things started to change in 1739. At that time, modern-day Florida was a colony of Spain, one of Britain's colonial rivals. In order to sabotage the plantation economy and just to show pure spite, the Spanish offered freedom to any British slave in North America who was able to reach St. Augustine, even though they themselves practiced slavery. To do this, the Spanish sent envoys and priests to inconspicuously tour the colonies and sneak into plantations. Once there, they spread the word of the promises of freedom from their colony. The slaves would have been very receptive to the message. The most obvious reason is that they wanted to be free. Unlike the enslaved people of the American Civil War who were born into bondage, the slaves of colonial South Carolina were born free. They remember what it was like before slavery, and they were willing to fight for it. Another factor would have been seeing Catholic priests bring news of liberation. As stated before, the Kingdom of Congo was a Catholic majority state where the church influenced the daily lives of its parishioners and those under them. When they were transported to the British colonies, the masters imposed Protestantism onto the people they now ruled. Seeing a symbol of their lives before enslavement gave the hope that they will breathe liberty soon again. They may have even seen it as a divine symbol, one indication to take action. The white people of South Carolina were also paranoid that a massive slave revolt would raise the plantation system that funded their way of life. As previously mentioned, the colonists pushed their Protestant faith onto the slaves. Not only that, but sermons for enslaved people were a means to use the Bible as a tool to tell said people how God's will is that they live in servitude to their white masters. South Carolina became nervous when they heard news of the Spanish priests and clergy were encouraging their slaves to run away to Florida. Therefore, South Carolina passed a law requiring men to bring guns to church on Sundays. The day would come on September 9, 1739. An enslaved man known as Jemmy led a group of other enslaved people to march down to Florida. Because it was a Sunday, the white planters would be in church and they left the slaves unsupervised. It was the most ideal time to take action. The group started out as a small band of a few dozen people with the sound of war drums and a banner that said Liberty. Despite the small size, they were able to become a tour de force. When they took over a plantation, their audacity inspired others to join, reaching a height of nearly 100 rebels. As a group this size, they were able to take over plantations and get back at the planters who owned them. Overall, they killed around 21 people. The violence, however, did have some exceptions. One of them was an innkeeper who was known to show kindness to enslaved people. The white people, unfortunately, were never going to accept slaves gaining any liberation. Determined to restore the plantation system, they responded with utter brutality. After 12 hours, the rebellion took a rest in the field. It was there where a white militia started firing upon the rebels, who fought back with everything they had. The militia had the upper hand, so they were able to kill or capture the majority of rebels, while others were able to fall back into the swamps. Those who were captured were re-enslaved, sold, or even executed. As for Jimmy, he disappeared from the historical record, but is often assumed that he was executed. As expected from colonial South Carolina, they determined that the cause of the rebellion wasn't the institution of slavery. They believed it was because of outside agitation and the slaves had too much freedom. The state enacted the Negro Act of 1740. This forbade enslaved people from forming groups, earning money, or learning to read and write. The last one was really important because it was believed that enslaved people who were literate could be introduced to ideas of liberty and how holding people in bondage is inherently in conflict with such ideas. These laws and customs lasted until the Civil War when slavery was abolished. That is where the story for today ends. A group of African slaves managed to rally fellow enslaved people in hopes of reaching the promised land. I like this story because it shows that people enslaved in American colonies were never happy with their condition. When the opportunity presented itself and seemed to be ordained by God, they took said opportunity. Some of them, especially the African warriors, knew that they risked death, but they found such a risk to be far more preferable than remaining in chains for the rest of their life. That is it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode. The History Zone with Zane Rossler was made possible thanks to the Richland Main Library in downtown Columbia, South Carolina.